Nostalgia is like a sanctuary in the mind, a story that we return to, often in the advent of encountering change and transitions. There's a great quote by Katherine Kohler Reisman: "Narratives do not mirror, they refract the past. Imagination and strategic interests influence how storytellers choose to connect events and make them meaningful for others. And narratives are useful in research precisely because storytellers interpret the past rather than reproduce it as it was." Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is very clearly a nostalgic and declarative love letter for the golden age of Hollywood from the late 60s, but what's interesting is that it deliberately uses its own sense of indulgence to spotlight and deconstruct the illusory nature of how nostalgia tells a story, all by playing with its own sense of symbolic credibility. In other words, this is a film that interrogates how nostalgia interprets as opposed to reproduce when it comes to representing memory. So yeah, this is gonna be a particularly pretentious essay, guys. Whoa. In the beginning, we're introduced to Rick Dalton and Cliff Booth by an ad, then an interview, which is used to establish a level of visual credibility to how it presents the time period. But what's interesting is that the film deliberately doesn't open with the characters off camera first. Instead, they're introduced through the in-universe fictional camera. Our relationship as the audience with the character is immediately overtly mediated.
Well, actors are required to do a lot of dangerous stuff.
We don't connect with them as people, we're connected by their professions first. So the landscape that is established isn't the mind of the characters, but the mind of a culture.
About to get his jaw busted.
This is further anchored by how a good chunk of the film is dedicated to showing Cliff traveling around town in Rick's car. The intent of the story is to provide a tour of a world and an old culture that is blurred from the movement across time. It's like the film is admitting that the logic of the nostalgia for the 60s Hollywood is very much based on a blur that thrives on a lack of concentration, but that vagueness is what makes it so incredibly glamorous. Subsequently, this is accentuated by Sharon Tate, who isn't supposed to be a character because she barely has any lines. Instead, she's more than a character, she's a symbol, an apogee to an entire feeling. Her smile, her joyous reflection in seeing her own films, she isn't based on the real person, but how Americans want to remember her. It's a bit weird that the same treatment wasn't done with Bruce Lee, but it's a really cool way to make material how nostalgia is very specifically, a type of remembering that pivots itself around emotions and feelings. This is a world distorted by love, but it's okay because its deception comes from its sincerity. The more you fetishize the past, the more you remove it from reality. It's a coy illusion that serves as an important sanctuary for human identity, but it's not real by nature. And the ramifications on how this traps the self is reflected by Rick Dalton's stagnant career.
Bullshit. You're a fucking miserable drunk.
The time of the 60s is coming to an end, so for actors like Rick, who is a mascot and is a living pastiche from all the attitudes from the time period, he's ultimately losing his relevance. There's two fun moments that really puts a shine to this. There's a scene where he regrets not taking the role in The Great Escape.
McQueen almost passed on the movie, and during that brief moment, I apparently was on the list of 4.
And his moment with Trudy, where his decline totally finally sinks in emotionally.
He's coming to terms with what it's like to be slightly more used.
Even though this performance is great and his craft is still at the top of his game, he's still dislocated and emotionally estranged. his career dissipates to the point that he can't afford to hire Cliff Booth anymore.
Journey is over. I think we reached the end of the trail, Cliff.
Time is like a process of erosion chipping away at his life, and nostalgia is a catalyst because it makes his own sense of identification deeply superficial. His name is all he can feel in his hands.
Rick fucking Dalton.
Oddly enough, Cliff Booth is the character that isn't mired in nostalgia because he's so dignified and nonchalant with life. And that ability to cruise on through everything is what makes him so invulnerable. While we see Rick break down and screw up, we see Cliff fixing something on a roof. When a douchebag hippie tries to screw with him, he takes none of it. Instead, it's hinted that he may or may not have killed his wife, so in contrast, he's got more of an antagonistic relationship with the past. The mini arc with the hitchhiking hippie girl is crucial in characterizing Cliff's personality. She latches onto him and he's smitten, but he never latches onto her in any way.
What I'm too old to do is go to jail for poontang.
To the extent that in the end, when she starts insulting him, it meant nothing to him. It doesn't affect him.
George isn't blind! You're the blind one!
He's a character that is never preoccupied with the past. As a result, these three characters map out a fun, diverse set of identification with memory. Rick is nostalgic for a different time that didn't happen. Cliff is indifferent and antagonistically pointed with the past, while Sharon Tate is the past made flesh. What makes Rick stick out as the central figure is that unlike the other two characters, he doesn't have an emotional lightness that gifted the others the ability to travel. Instead, his sense of embarrassment distorts his sense of self-respect. Inevitability is the core movement that characterizes the whole ordeal, and this is symbolized by the parting of ways.
Took a cab home.
Greatest action director, underrated guy of all time.
This is a story more or less about storytelling, and the departure of these characters is the nostalgia giving into reality. That is until the climax. To play with this temporal horizon, Tarantino goes out of his way to rupture this world that he's created by twisting the reality into a completely absurd direction.
Sorry we disturbed you.
Look, Chief, you don't belong here. Now take this mechanical asshole and get it off!
By taking the Manson murders, which became a historical marker for this era of Hollywood, he destroys his world in the most hilariously indulgent way possible. Which on one hand is still quite stylistically consistent, but on the other hand, it's also the film deliberately making the audience be aware that, yeah, none of this was real in the first place. Nostalgia fundamentally rewrites history because it's remembering not only motivated by sentimentality, but remembering the past in general is largely influenced by our opinions of the present. Consequently, killing the Manson forces the audience to be aware that it's all malleable. Nostalgia is as fluid and disempowering as it is empowering, if that makes sense. So murdering them and turning them into a bunch of buffoons is the act of killing their symbolic value, to destroy their signification by turning their signifiers and transforming the connotations. And that's the most interesting thing about this film's sense of self-awareness. It's like it's written and directed deliberately to occupy and play around the gap between the individual and their memory, in order for itself to have the space to be free, to be able to run around. And in doing so, it ends up mapping out the limits of remembering. So that's pretty cool. The final conversation is also the film at its most artistically naked. It's the realities of the fictional characters finally meeting with the illusory reality of nostalgia, and they fit together to show a sincere wish for the glamorous dream of this time period to never end. In the end, Rick goes through the gates and gets to hang out with Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate. The camera rises above the scene and we see these characters as tiny figures. We opened with the media footage of these characters in a stage production, and we end with Rick entering a never-happened past. both the media and the nostalgia are equally untrue, and they end up intensely producing the other. It could also be just Tarantino having a laugh, but so, I don't know. Digesting this film in a way gave me a similar feeling I had when I was walking through Toys R Us when it was being closed. And I'm going somewhere with this. Taking those steps into the empty store felt like a form of emotional interrogation. This big, wonderful place that had projected so much happiness and excitement in my upbringing turned out to be an image that was just white shelves and cardboard boxes. It didn't surprise me, obviously, but it made me think about how superficial and yet incredibly provocative this nostalgic illusion really is. And I think that emotional interrogation is what Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is trying to do when it comes to that cultural impression that Americans have for that late 60s Hollywood era. It's all artificial, especially when you tear it down and expose all the insides, but there's nothing wrong with the precious meaning that it passes on to in the minds of everyone. And I think that's the rich little idea that is deep down inside carried in this film. Or it could just be me rambling for 10 minutes, whatever.